A routine flight becomes the stage for an explosive confrontation when Sarah Mitchell, a flight attendant harboring deep-seated prejudices, encounters a mysterious first-class passenger who seems oddly unfazed by her increasingly hostile behavior. As tensions rise and passengers watch in silent horror, no one suspects that her target is far more than he appears to be. What begins as a series of microaggressions escalates into a shocking incident that will change multiple lives forever. But who really holds the power in this high-altitude confrontation? The answer will leave everyone stunned. But before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Atlanta International Airport's crew lounge, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah Mitchell stood before the mirror, adjusting her perfectly pressed navy uniform and smoothing her blonde hair into an immaculate bun. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed they knew exactly how the world should work. "Can you believe this new hiring policy?" Sarah scoffed, addressing her reflection as much as her colleague Jenny, who was applying mascara nearby. "They're so obsessed with their precious diversity quotas, they're practically giving away jobs now." Jenny shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, used to Sarah's daily complaints. Sarah continued, gathering her belongings for the morning flight to Chicago. "Did you see the new batch of flight attendants they hired? I mean, seriously? Half of them can barely speak proper English." She rolled her eyes, checking her phone. "I'm telling you, this airline is going downhill fast. They're catering to the wrong crowd." As if to prove her point, Sarah's attention was drawn to a black passenger approaching the customer service desk just outside the lounge. The elderly man, wearing a neat but worn suit, was clearly lost. "Excuse me," he called out politely. "Could you help me find gate B22? Sarah, who was heading out anyway, pretended not to hear him, quickening her pace. The man called out again, more urgently this time. "Ma'am? Please, my flight boards in 20 minutes. Sarah turned, her smile tight and artificial. "Sir, I'm not customer service. There's an information desk down that way." She pointed vaguely in the opposite direction of his gate, knowing full well it was just around the corner from where they stood. The elderly man's shoulders slumped as he shuffled away, and Sarah smirked, muttering under her breath, "Some people expect everything handed to them." Meanwhile, in another part of the terminal, Captain Darius Blake moved through the crowd with quiet purpose. At 45, he carried himself with natural authority, though his casual attire, dark jeans, a crisp white button-down, and a leather jacket, gave no hint of his position in law enforcement. His observant brown eyes took in everything around him, a habit formed over 2 decades of police work. "Excuse me," a voice called out. "Are you headed to Chicago?" Darius turned to find a woman in her 60s struggling with her carry-on bag. Her name tag identified her as a conference speaker, Dr. Patricia Wellington. "Yes, ma'am, I am," he replied, already moving to help with her bag. "Oh, thank you. These wheels are giving me trouble." She studied him curiously. "Are you attending the law enforcement conference too?" Darius smiled, lifting her bag easily. "I am, though I'm just there to learn." "I see you're speaking." "Yes, on community policing initiatives." "Are you in law enforcement yourself?" "I do what I can to help the community," he replied modestly, deliberately avoiding mentioning his rank as captain of one of Chicago's largest precincts. They chatted as they walked to the gate, where Dr. Wellington's eyes widened at seeing his first-class boarding pass. "Oh my, you're up in first class. I'll be back in coach with the rest of us mere mortals." Darius laughed warmly. "Just lucky with some airline points, that's all. Here, let me help you get this bag stored before I head up front." As passengers settled into their seats, Sarah stood at the front of the first-class cabin, her professional smile firmly in place. Then she saw him, Darius, taking his seat in 2A. Her smile flickered for a moment before she caught herself. "Ticket, please," she said, her voice overly sweet. Darius handed it over without comment. Sarah studied the ticket far longer than necessary, flipping it over twice. "And your boarding pass?" He provided that too, his expression neutral but aware. Around them, other passengers began to notice the interaction. "Is there a problem?" asked a businessman across the aisle. "Not at all," Sarah replied, her tone suggesting otherwise. "Just being thorough." We have very specific standards in first class. Darius simply smiled, a knowing look in his eyes that seemed to unsettle Sarah even more. She moved on, but kept glancing back at him throughout the boarding process. As the flight got underway, Sarah's behavior became increasingly obvious. When serving drinks, she approached Darius last, despite him being in the second row. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Coffee black, please. And a napkin if you have one." Sarah returned with the coffee, but no napkin, practically dropping the cup on his tray table. Some of it sloshed over the side. "Oh, sorry about that," she said. "Not sorry at all. We seem to be out of napkins. You know how it is. Some people take more than their fair share." A young woman in 2B, Lauren Shun, caught Darius's eye, her expression apologetic and uncomfortable. She pulled a tissue from her purse and offered it to him. "Here you go," she said quietly. "Thank you," Darius replied, dabbing at the spilled coffee. "Very kind of you." Sarah's voice carried from the galley, where she spoke to another flight attendant, Emily Torres. "It's ridiculous, really. Some people get upgrades they clearly don't deserve. It devalues the whole experience for our regular first-class passengers." Emily frowned. "Sarah, that's enough. You need to maintain a professional attitude." "Stay out of it," Sarah snapped. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work." The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Lauren Shin had pulled out her phone and appeared to be texting someone, her eyes occasionally darting between Darius and Sarah. Other passengers exchanged concerned glances, some shaking their heads in disapproval. When Darius pressed his call button to request water, Sarah's response was immediate and hostile. She marched to his seat, slamming a plastic cup of water onto his tray table, causing it to splash. "Anything else?" she asked through gritted teeth. "No, thank you," Darius replied calmly, pulling out a small notebook and making a brief note. His composed reaction seemed to infuriate Sarah even more. Emily approached again, speaking in a hushed tone. "Sarah, I really think you should take a break. I can handle first class for a while." "I told you to stay out of it," Sarah hissed. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Throughout all this, Darius remained a study in self-control. He sat quietly observing, his expression neutral, but his eyes missing nothing. He occasionally wrote in his notebook, each entry seeming to agitate Sarah further. The businessman across the aisle, Michael Thompson, finally spoke up. "Miss, I'd like to speak to your supervisor about your behavior." "File a complaint," Sarah replied dismissively. "I'm sure it'll get all the attention it deserves." As she turned away, Darius's voice carried clearly through the cabin. "I wonder what you'll do next." Sarah froze mid-step, turning slowly to face him. Their eyes met in a moment of tension, his calm and knowing, hers filled with barely contained anger. "Is that a threat, sir?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Not at all," Darius replied smoothly. "Just an observation. I'm very good at those, you see. Been doing it professionally for years." The implied meaning hung in the air, but Sarah was too caught up in her own prejudices to read the warning signs. Instead, she saw only what she wanted to see. Someone she believed didn't belong in her first-class cabin, someone she could push around with impunity. As she retreated to the galley, Laurention leaned over to Darius. "I can't believe how she's treating you," she whispered. "Someone should do something." "Someone will," Darius replied quietly, making another note in his book. "It's just a matter of time." The flight was barely an hour old, but the atmosphere in first class had become electric with anticipation. Sarah's behavior had crossed so many lines, yet Darius's composed responses suggested a man who knew something she didn't. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, every passenger in first class could sense that this story was far from over. What no one knew yet was just how dramatically things were about to change, or how this routine flight would become a powerful lesson in consequences and justice. Sarah Mitchell's fingers drummed against the galley counter as fragments of whispered conversations drifted toward her. Each hushed word, each disapproving glance from the first-class passengers felt like a personal attack. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a childhood memory from their small Alabama home. "They're taking everything from us, Sarah Beth. Our jobs, our neighborhoods, our way of life. Don't you ever let them think they're better than you." She'd grown up with those words, absorbed them with her mother's sweet tea and her father's bitter prejudices. Now, at 32, watching Darius calmly write in his notebook, those deeply rooted beliefs twisted inside her like poisonous vines. "I can't believe how she's treating him," Laurentian whispered to Michael Thompson across the aisle, not quite quietly enough. "Completely unprofessional," Thompson replied, his voice carrying deliberately. "I've already drafted an email to customer service. In 30 years of flying, I've never seen such blatant." Sarah's hands trembled as she arranged cups on her service card. The coffee pot burbled behind her, fresh and scalding hot. In her mind, she could see her father's approving nod, the same nod he'd given her when she'd refused to serve the black family at her first waitressing job at 16. She'd lost that job, but Daddy had been so proud. Emily Torres approached cautiously, her young face pinched with concern. "Sarah, maybe you should take your break now. You seem tense." "I seem tense?" Sarah's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria. "What I am is sick of people questioning how I do my job. Did you see him? Sitting there, writing God knows what, acting like he owns the place. He's just a passenger. He's making a mockery of first class," Sarah hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Probably used stolen points or something to get up here. And now he's got everyone watching me like I'm doing something wrong." Sarah grabbed the fresh pot of coffee she'd just brewed, its contents still steaming. Through the rising vapor, she saw her reflection in the metallic surface. Blonde hair, perfectly styled, uniform immaculate, face twisted with an ugly hatred she usually kept better hidden. "Well, if they want something to watch." "Sarah, don't." Emily reached for her arm, but Sarah shrugged her off. The few steps down the aisle felt like walking through molasses. Every passenger seemed to be watching now, their eyes following her movement. Darius continued writing, his pen moving steadily across the page. The sight of his calm, dignified demeanor made something snap inside her. A memory flashed. Her father ranting about the new black family that had moved onto their street, how property values would plummet, how the neighborhood would never be the same. She'd been 12 then, absorbing his hatred like a sponge. Now, 20 years later, that hatred had fermented into something toxic and actionable. "More coffee, sir." Her voice dripped with false sweetness. Darius looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of awareness and quiet challenge, that made her hands tighten around the coffee pot. Without warning, she tilted it, letting the scalding liquid pour directly onto his face and chest. The reaction was immediate and cacophonous. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin. Lauren Chen's scream pierced the air like a knife. Darius jerked back, coffee streaming down his face and soaking his white shirt, which now clung to his chest. The notebook fell to the floor, its pages splattered with brown stains. "Oh my God!" Mrs. Henderson, an elderly passenger in 3C, clutched her chest. "Someone help him. Call the captain," another voice shouted. "I'm a doctor." A man in 4A stood up. "Sir, let me look at those burns." Sarah stepped back, her face a mask of manufactured concern, even as satisfaction bloomed in her chest. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. But you moved so suddenly. I wasn't expecting you to jerk forward like that. You didn't move at all." Lauren Chin stood up, her phone in her hand, screen clearly displaying a recording in progress. "I recorded the whole thing. You poured it on him deliberately." "That's ridiculous," Sarah scoffed, but her voice wavered slightly. "It was clearly an accident. These things happen during turbulence." "What turbulence?" Michael Thompson demanded, also brandishing his phone. "The seatbelt sign isn't even on." Throughout the chaos, Darius remained remarkably composed. Despite the obvious pain, his face and neck had already begun to redden from the burns. He reached for the napkin Lauren had given him earlier and carefully dabbed at his face. His composure seemed to infuriate Sarah even more. In her mind, he was supposed to react, to lose control, to prove every toxic thing her father had taught her about them. "I need some ice, please," he said, his voice steady but tight with controlled pain. "And perhaps some burn cream if you have it in your first aid kit." Dr. James Morrison from 4A had reached him by now. "Sir, these burns look second degree. You'll need medical attention when we land." Emily rushed forward with a bag of ice wrapped in a cloth. "Sir, I am so sorry. Let me help you clean up." Don't coddle him, Sarah snapped, her father's words flowing through her like poison. It was an accident. He should have been paying attention instead of writing in that little book of his. The mention of the notebook drew Darius's attention to where it had fallen. Despite his burns, he carefully retrieved it, checking its pages before tucking it into his jacket pocket. The deliberate care with which he handled it made Sarah's skin crawl. "I need to file a complaint immediately," Mrs. Henderson announced, her arthritis-gnarled fingers fumbling with her phone as she took pictures. "I saw everything." She poured that coffee on him deliberately. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Several other passengers had their phones out, either recording or taking photos. Sarah's facade of concern began to crack under the weight of their accusations. She could hear her father's voice again. "Never back down, Sarah Beth. The moment you show weakness, they win. You're all overreacting," she said, her voice rising. "If certain people weren't so sensitive about everything." "Certain people?" Laurention interrupted, her voice sharp. "Why don't you just say what you really mean, Sarah?" Emily stepped between them, her young face set with determination. "Sarah, you need to go to the back of the plane right now. I'm calling the lead flight attendant." "Are you serious?" Sarah laughed incredulously. "You're taking their side? After everything I taught you about handling these situations?" "These situations?" Emily's voice shook with anger. "You mean situations where you deliberately harm passengers because of your prejudices?" "No, you didn't teach me about those, and I'm grateful you didn't." Sarah's face flushed red. "How dare you? I've been flying this route for 10 years. You've been here, what, 6 months? You don't get to tell me what to do." While they argued, Laurention had gotten up to help Darius. She held the ice pack against his neck while he continued to dab at his face. His white shirt was ruined, the coffee stain spreading across the fabric like a Rorschach test of Sarah's hatred. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" she asked quietly. "My sister's a nurse. Those burns look serious." "I'll be fine," Darius replied, his voice still remarkably steady. "Though I appreciate everyone's concern." He turned to face Sarah, who was still arguing with Emily. The movement caught her attention, and she fell silent as their eyes met. For the first time, something in his steady gaze made her feel uncertain. There was knowledge there, a quiet confidence that suggested he held cards she couldn't see. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." Sarah tried to maintain her bravado, but her voice trembled slightly as she replied, "Good luck with that. It was an accident, plain and simple. Your word against mine." "And ours," Michael Thompson interjected, holding up his phone. "I started recording after your earlier behavior. Got the whole thing on video." "As did I," Lauren added. "Me too," called another passenger. Sarah's face paled slightly, but she forced a dismissive laugh. Her father's voice was fainter now, drowned out by the growing chorus of witnesses. "Record all you want. Accidents happen all the time in flight. Good luck proving otherwise." The lead flight attendant, Margaret Wilson, arrived from business class, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. At 55, she'd seen her share of difficult situations, but the tension in the cabin told her this was something different. "What happened here?" she demanded. Before Sarah could speak, multiple passengers began explaining at once. Margaret held up her hand for silence. "Sir," she addressed Darius, "are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" "I've had worse," he replied calmly, still holding the ice pack. "Though I would appreciate it if someone could note down the names of these kind witnesses. Their testimony might be important later." Sarah's smug expression faltered slightly at his words. Something about the way he said testimony seemed to carry extra weight. Dr. Morrison spoke up. "As a medical professional, I strongly recommend immediate attention when we land. These burns are serious." Margaret turned to Sarah. "Go to the back of the plane. Wait there until we land. We'll discuss this with ground staff." As Sarah retreated, she could hear passengers sharing contact information, organizing their video evidence. Her father's voice was gone now, replaced by a growing dread. She'd acted on the prejudices he'd instilled in her, but for the first time, she had a feeling there would be consequences he couldn't protect her from. The plane began its descent into Chicago, the atmosphere in the cabin charged with anticipation. Passengers spoke in hushed voices, occasionally glancing between Sarah, who stood rigid in the back galley, and Darius, who had resumed writing in his coffee-stained notebook. Lauren leaned over. "What are you writing?" Darius smiled slightly, despite his burns. Just making sure I have all the details correct. Times, names, specific actions. My line of work has taught me the importance of thorough documentation. From her position in the back, Sarah watched him write, her earlier confidence crumbling. There was something about his methodical note-taking that suggested he was far more than just another passenger she could push around. Her father's lessons about maintaining power and control seemed hollow now, faced with Darius's quiet dignity and the united opposition of the other passengers. Emily passed by with fresh ice, pausing briefly. "I hope it was worth it," she said quietly. "Whatever happens next, you brought this on yourself." Sarah opened her mouth to deliver another cutting remark, but the words died in her throat as Darius closed his notebook and turned to look directly at her. Despite the angry red burns on his face and neck, his expression remained composed, almost pitying. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. The plane's wheels touched down on the runway, and Sarah felt her stomach lurch, not from the landing, but from the growing realization that she might have finally gone too far. As they taxied to the gate, she noticed several passengers already on their phones, no doubt sharing videos of the incident on social media. Her father's teachings about maintaining superiority seemed like a cruel joke now, leading her not to power, but to what she suspected would be a very public downfall. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Local time is 2:45 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach our gate, and the sign has been turned off." Sarah watched as Darius made one final note in his book. Whatever he wrote made him smile slightly, not a smile of joy, but one of grim determination. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and gave her a small nod, as if to say, "You brought this on yourself." The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to stir. But something in the air told everyone that this story was far from over. Sarah stood in the back, her father's voice finally silent, replaced by the growing certainty that her actions would have consequences far beyond this flight. Whatever came next would change lives forever, and Sarah was beginning to suspect she wouldn't like how this particular story would end. The jet bridge hummed with tension as passengers began their slow exodus from the aircraft. Sarah Mitchell stood at the forward galley, mechanically reciting, "Thank you for flying with us," while avoiding eye contact with most passengers. Despite the earlier incident, she maintained an air of defiance. After all, she dealt with passenger complaints before. They rarely amounted to anything more than a slap on the wrist. "This'll blow over by tomorrow," she whispered to herself, straightening her scarf. Just another entitled passenger, making a scene. Behind her, Emily Torres watched with barely concealed disgust as she assisted elderly passengers with their bags. The burns on Darius's face and neck had deepened to an angry red, but he remained seated, calmly organizing his belongings and making final notes in his coffee-stained notebook. Laurention paused in the aisle beside him. "Sir, I've uploaded the video to my cloud drive. Here's my card. I'm happy to serve as a witness." "Thank you," Darius replied, tucking the card carefully into his jacket pocket. "Your assistance has been invaluable." Michael Thompson and several other first-class passengers had also lingered, forming an impromptu support group around Darius. Sarah's smirk faltered slightly as she noticed their unified front. As the last economy passengers filtered past, Darius finally stood, wincing slightly as his burned skin pulled against his coffee-stained shirt. He made his way toward the exit, the small crowd of supportive passengers following in his wake. Sarah's confident facade cracked when she saw what awaited in the jet bridge. For uniformed police officers stood at attention, flanking a distinguished-looking man with chief's insignia on his collar. As Darius emerged from the aircraft, the chief snapped to attention and offered a crisp salute. "Welcome to Chicago, Captain Blake," he said formally. "We came as soon as we got word of the incident." Sarah's face drained of color. "Captain Blake?" The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The passenger she deliberately scalded with coffee wasn't just any traveler. He was a police captain. Her legs went weak as the implications crashed over her. "Chief Rodriguez," Darius acknowledged, returning the salute. "I appreciate the welcome, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Laurention stepped forward, her phone already in hand. "Officers, I have video evidence of the assault." Would you like to see it now? Assault? Sarah's voice cracked. It was an accident. You can't possibly. We can see it quite clearly, Lauren interrupted, playing the video. The footage was damning, showing Sarah's deliberate tilt of the coffee pot, the lack of turbulence, and the obvious intent behind her actions. Airline officials had arrived by now. A stern-faced woman in a corporate suit introduced herself as Regina Martinez, Regional Director of Flight Operations. She watched the video with growing horror. Ms. Mitchell, she said, turning to Sarah, you are suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Please surrender your crew ID and security credentials. But you don't understand. Sarah's voice took on a desperate edge. The video doesn't show the full story. He was being provocative, writing things about me, trying to intimidate me with that notebook. Dr. Morrison stepped forward. I'm a physician, and I can testify that those burns were no accident. Captain Blake needs medical attention, second-degree burns at minimum. Sarah's world was crumbling around her. More passengers had stopped to film the unfolding scene, their phones capturing her downfall in real time. She could see them typing, no doubt sharing the story on social media already. Chief Rodriguez addressed the gathering crowd. Captain Blake commands our largest precinct. He was en route to deliver a keynote speech at the National Law Enforcement Conference on Community Policing and Racial Equity. The irony was not lost on anyone. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of accusing eyes. Her father's teachings about maintaining power suddenly seemed hollow and pathetic. Emily spoke up from the aircraft door. Ms. Martinez, I'd like to file an official statement. This wasn't an isolated incident. I've witnessed Sarah's problematic behavior toward minorities before. Within hours, the story exploded across social media. The hashtag Justice for Captain Blake began trending nationally. The original video, shared by Lauren Shin, accumulated millions of views within the first hour. At passenger rights, flight attendant deliberately pours scalding coffee on black police captain. Warning. Disturbing footage hashtag Justice for Captain Blake. At aviation news. Breaking. Major airline suspends flight attendant after racist assault caught on camera. Victim identified as decorated police captain. At Civil Rights Watch. This is what systemic racism looks like in action. Time for airlines to address bias in their ranks. Hashtag Justice for Captain Blake. The airline's PR team scrambled to contain the damage. By evening, they had issued a formal statement. We are deeply disturbed by the incident that occurred on Flight 2847. The actions of our employee do not reflect our values or commitment to inclusion. We have suspended the crew member involved and are conducting a thorough investigation. We extend our sincere apologies to Captain Blake and all our passengers who witnessed this troubling event. Sarah sat in a sterile conference room at O'Hare, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the endless social media comments. Her name and face were everywhere. Reporters had already dug up her social media history, finding years of subtle racist comments and dog whistles that now painted a damning picture. Ms. Mitchell, Regina Martinez said, closing a thick folder of incident reports. Your employment with the airline is terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, we will be cooperating fully with law enforcement regarding potential criminal charges. Criminal charges? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Assault, possibly with hate crime enhancements, one of the airline's lawyers confirmed. The evidence is quite clear. Meanwhile, in the airport's executive conference room, Darius Blake stood before a crowd of reporters after receiving medical treatment. His burned skin had been properly dressed, but the angry red marks were still visible above his collar. I'm not here to call for vengeance, he began, his voice steady. What happened today is symptomatic of a deeper problem, one that can't be solved by punishing a single person. The reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing. This incident could have ended very differently, Darius continued. If I had reacted with anger, justified as it might have been, it would have reinforced existing prejudices. Instead, I chose to document, to remain calm, and to let justice take its proper course. A reporter raised her hand. Captain Blake, what changes would you like to see airlines make? Comprehensive bias training is essential, he replied. But more importantly, we need systems of accountability. Other passengers and crew members saw problematic behavior building throughout the flight. We need clear protocols for intervention before situations escalate. Social media erupted with new hashtags. Hashtag #BeLikeCaptainBlake and hashtag DignityWins began trending alongside calls for airline reform. At Community Leader, this is what real leadership looks like. Captain Blake turns trauma into teachable moment. Hashtag #BeLikeCaptainBlake. At Airline Pilot, as a pilot, I stand with Captain Blake. Time for serious industry-wide changes in how we handle discrimination. Hashtag DignityWins. The airline announced immediate changes. Mandatory quarterly bias training for all staff, revised reporting procedures for discriminatory incidents, and the formation of a passenger advocacy board to review complaints. Sarah's world had contracted to the small room where she sat with her union representative, watching her career and reputation implode in real time. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues distancing themselves, media requests she was advised not to answer, and even her father, whose toxic teachings had led her to this moment, telling her not to call home until this mess blows over. Looking at the viral video for the 100th time, she finally saw herself through others' eyes. The smug expression, the deliberate tilt of the coffee pot, the naked hatred she'd failed to hide. Her father's voice in her head was silent now, replaced by the crushing weight of consequences. What happens next? She asked her union rep quietly. Best case scenario? You'll face civil penalties, probably never work in the industry again. Worst case? Criminal charges, possible jail time. Either way, Ms. Mitchell, your actions will follow you for a long time. In the coming days, the story sparked a national conversation about racism in the service industry. Other flight attendants and passengers came forward with similar stories, creating a movement for change that extended beyond airlines to hotels, restaurants, and retail establishments. Darius Blake became an unexpected symbol of dignity in the face of discrimination. His measured response and focus on systemic change rather than personal vengeance earned him widespread respect and speaking engagements across the country. The airline's swift action, terminating Sarah and implementing immediate policy changes, was praised as a model response, though some critics argued it shouldn't have taken such a high-profile incident to prompt necessary reforms. Lauren Chin's video continued to circulate as a teaching tool in corporate training sessions, showing both the overt act of racism and the smaller microaggressions that led up to it. Emily Torres was commended for speaking up and later promoted to a role in the airline's newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Department. A week after the incident, Darius Blake stood before the law enforcement conference, his burns still visible but healing, and delivered a keynote speech that differed from his original planned remarks. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one person's hatred, he told the packed auditorium. It was about the systems that allow that hatred to flourish unchecked. Each of us has a choice when we witness discrimination. We can be silent observers, or we can be agents of change. The speech was broadcast nationally, with commentators praising its calls for accountability, while noting the painful irony that it took an assault on a police captain to bring these issues to the forefront. Sarah Mitchell, watching the speech on her laptop in her now empty apartment, finally understood the full impact of her actions. Her father's teachings about maintaining power through hatred had led only to her own downfall. The control she'd thought she wielded had been an illusion, shattered by the quiet dignity of a man she'd tried to humiliate. As Captain Blake concluded his speech, she closed her laptop and faced her new reality. Her name would become synonymous with the consequences of unchecked prejudice, a cautionary tale in corporate training sessions. The power she tried to assert had backfired spectacularly, leaving her jobless, infamous, and forced to confront the ugliness of her own beliefs. The incident on Flight 2847 became more than just another viral video. It became a catalyst for change, a moment when one man's composed response to hatred helped drive a national conversation about accountability and reform. The lessons learned would ripple through industries and institutions, a reminder that dignity often speaks louder than hate. 6 months after the incident on Flight 2847, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her bathroom mirror, barely recognizing her reflection. Her once perfect blonde hair hung limp and unstyled, dark roots showing through. The designer clothes she'd worn with such pride had been sold to pay legal fees. The confident smirk that had once been her trademark was replaced by drawn lines of worry and exhaustion. Her phone buzzed. Another threatening message from a stranger who'd found her number. Hope you enjoy being unemployable, racist. She'd stopped counting such messages months ago. Her social media accounts had been deleted after the flood of death threats began, but people still found ways to reach her. Her father hadn't spoken to her since the video went viral, her final call home ending with him saying, "You didn't just ruin your own life, Sarah Beth. You made our whole family look bad." The job search had been futile. Her name brought up millions of hits on Google, all relating to the incident. Even businesses far removed from the airline industry wouldn't touch her. The viral video had become a case study in corporate anti-bias training across the country. She'd moved from her luxury apartment to a small studio in a different city, but her infamy followed. Just last week, a neighbor had recognized her at the laundromat. "Aren't you that flight attendant?" the woman had asked loudly. "The one who poured coffee on the police captain?" Sarah had grabbed her wet clothes and fled, leaving half her laundry behind. Meanwhile, across the country, Captain Darius Blake stood before a packed auditorium at the National Aviation Service Training Center. His burns had healed, leaving only faint scars that served as a powerful visual reminder of his message. Change doesn't come from mandatory training videos, he told the assembled airline executives and staff. It comes from creating a culture where everyone feels responsible for speaking up, where Emily Torres, that young flight attendant, feels empowered to confront discrimination, where passengers like Lauren Chin know their voices matter. The audience hung on his every word. In the months since the incident, he'd become a leading voice in corporate diversity and inclusion efforts. His calm handling of the situation held up as a model of dignity under pressure. "We're not just training staff to avoid negative behaviors," he continued. "We're creating advocates for positive change. Every person in this room has the power to transform a moment of hate into an opportunity for growth." In the audience, Lauren Chin smiled. Her life had changed dramatically since her video went viral. What started as an instinctive decision to record Sarah's behavior had evolved into a new career path. She'd left her marketing job to work full-time on anti-discrimination initiatives, her viral post having sparked a movement. Her original Twitter thread had become legendary. "Just witnessed the most blatant act of racism on my flight. But here's what gives me hope." Everyone spoke up. The elderly woman who demanded accountability. The doctor who provided care. The young flight attendant who risked her job to do what's right. "This is how we make change." #Justice for Captain Blake. The thread had been shared millions of times, inspiring others to share their own stories of standing up against discrimination. Lauren had appeared on national news programs, written opinion pieces, and helped develop bystander intervention training programs. Back in her studio apartment, Sarah sat at her small desk, crumpling another attempt at a letter to Darius. The floor was littered with discarded drafts. How do you apologize for something that came from such a deep well of hatred? How do you acknowledge that everything you were taught to believe was wrong? Finally, after dozens of attempts, she began writing. "Dear Captain Blake, I've started this letter 100 times, trying to find the right words. But maybe that's part of the problem. I've always been concerned with finding the right words to justify wrong actions. What I did to you is indefensible. It came from a place of hatred that I'd been taught since childhood, but chose to maintain into adulthood. I watched the video of myself countless times, trying to understand how I could act with such cruelty. Each time, I see not just the moment with the coffee, but all the small aggressions leading up to it. Each one a choice I made to dehumanize you. I've lost my job, my home, my friends, and my reputation. But those are consequences, not excuses. What I lost through my actions doesn't compare to the dignity you maintain despite my attempts to strip it from you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that your response to my hatred, your calm strength, and focus on creating positive change, forced me to confront everything I was taught to believe. The world my father promised would fall apart if we showed weakness. You proved it was built on lies. I don't expect a response. I just needed you to know that your dignity in the face of my hatred changed at least one person's heart. Sincerely, Sarah Mitchell. She sent the letter through her lawyer, having lost her right to contact Darius directly due to the restraining order. She didn't expect a response, but the act of writing it marked a turning point in her own journey. The airline industry had undergone significant changes in the months following the incident. United Airways, where Sarah had worked, led the charge with sweeping reforms. Their new training program, developed in consultation with Captain Blake, went far beyond traditional sensitivity training. "We're not just teaching people what not to do," explained Regina Martinez, now promoted to VP of Culture and Inclusion. "We're creating a comprehensive system of accountability and support." Other airlines followed suit, leading to industry-wide changes. The incident had become a watershed moment in corporate America's approach to addressing systemic racism. Sarah's journey toward redemption began unexpectedly. While searching for any job that would hire her, she came across a community center serving predominantly minority neighborhoods. Despite her notoriety, or perhaps because of it, the center's director, Marcus Washington, agreed to let her volunteer. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow," he told her. "But understand this. You'll be working with the very people you once looked down on. Your actions will speak louder than any apology." The work was humbling. Sarah found herself serving meals to elderly Black residents, tutoring immigrant children, and helping with job training programs. Each interaction chipped away at the prejudices she'd carried for so long. One day, an elderly woman at the center recognized her. "You're that flight attendant," she said quietly. Sarah braced herself for the usual condemnation, but the woman surprised her. "You know what gives me hope?" the woman continued. "Seeing you here, doing the work. Hatred taught is hatred that can be unlearned." Captain Blake's influence continued to grow. He was promoted to deputy commissioner, using his platform to advocate for systemic change across multiple industries. His speeches drew thousands, but he always made time to mentor young officers and speak at community events. "The incident on that flight wasn't the beginning or end of the story," he often said. "It was a moment that revealed what was always there, both the persistence of prejudice and the power of collective action to combat it." Lauren Chen's viral post had evolved into a movement. Her Twitter thread was now taught in journalism schools as an example of how social media can drive social change. She'd started a nonprofit organization, Speak Up Now, training people in effective bystander intervention. "The most common question I get," she told a group of college students, "is whether I was afraid to start recording. Of course I was, but I was more afraid of staying silent. Every time we witness discrimination and say nothing, we become part of the problem." Emily Torres, the young flight attendant who had stood up to Sarah, had also found her voice. She now led United's peer-to-peer training program, helping other employees recognize and respond to discrimination. "It's not enough to not be racist," she explained in a training session. "We have to be actively anti-racist. That means having the courage to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable." 1 year after the incident, Sarah sat in her small apartment, watching Captain Blake on television. He was receiving an award for his work in civil rights and police reform. The camera panned to the audience, showing Lauren Chen, Emily Torres, and others who had been on that flight. They had all turned a moment of hatred into a movement for change. Sarah's letter to Darius sat on his desk at the precinct. He'd read it several times, recognizing the genuine transformation in her words. While he chose not to respond directly, he did mention it in a speech about restorative justice. "Sometimes, the greatest impact we can have is not in punishing wrongdoing, but in creating space for genuine transformation," he said. "The person who once acted from hatred may become the strongest advocate for change, precisely because they understand the journey from darkness to light." Sarah watched this speech too, tears rolling down her face as she recognized her own story in his words. She'd lost everything she once thought important, but found something more valuable: the chance to rebuild herself based on truth rather than hatred. The story of Flight 2847 became more than a viral video or a cautionary tale. It became a teaching tool, showing how a single moment of confrontation between hatred and dignity could spark lasting change. Captain Blake's calm strength, the passengers' united stand against discrimination, and even Sarah's eventual journey toward redemption all demonstrated that change was possible. In corporate training rooms, college classrooms, and community centers across the country, the incident was studied not just for what went wrong, but for what went right: how collective action, moral courage, and a refusal to meet hatred with hatred could transform a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light. The final chapter wasn't about Sarah's downfall or even Darius's triumph. It was about the power of human dignity to inspire change, one person at a time. The viral video showed the worst of humanity, but the response to it, from the passengers who spoke up, to the reforms it inspired, to the personal transformations it sparked, showed humanity at its best. As Sarah continued her volunteer work at the community center, she kept Captain Blake's words about her letter posted on her wall, the journey from darkness to light. It wasn't about forgiveness or redemption in the eyes of others. It was about the daily choice to unmake hatred, to challenge old beliefs, and to prove that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome through humility, hard work, and a willingness to change. The story of Flight 2847 would be told for years to come, not as a simple tale of right and wrong, but as a complex narrative about the possibility of transformation, both personal and systemic. It showed that even in our darkest moments, dignity could prevail, justice could be served without vengeance, and hate could be transformed into hope. And somewhere in Chicago, Captain Darius Blake kept Sarah's letter in his desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating an enemy, but in helping them find their way to a better version of themselves. If you like this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I dedicate my heart to bringing you these touching stories. Your support means more than words can express. Thank you for being a part of this journey.